Hey everybody, NFI Hammer here. Today I'm going to be painting 7 unique terrain pieces called the Primal Lair Beastgrave terrain set. I'm super excited about these because they're very unique and different terrain. They're part of the Age of Sigmar fantasy range, and they pair with the Underworlds board game, which I've started getting into and trying to get some of my friends into. So very excited to get this going. Let's get started. I got these terrain pieces from the Stormbringer magazine, which is similar to the Warhammer Imperium magazine for 40k, but this is the Age of Sigmar variant. And it's very cheap for just $20 dues. You get sometimes a whole Underworlds warband, or in this case, the entire Beastgrave terrain. Now, I'm very excited to paint this terrain. Even though terrain is by far my least popular videos, I do enjoy painting it because I feel a lot less pressure in making terrain look perfect. When I'm painting one of my Necron units or a warband, I feel so much extra stress because I want them to look perfect. But with terrain, I've noticed that people don't really care as much. As long as it's painted and it's not grey, people are kind of happy with it, and it helps with the immersion and making the battlefield interesting. So for me, I actually kind of can relax a little bit and not stress out. The assembling of this was really straightforward. It's just kind of plug in play. There was very little glue needed. I'm using my Rust-Oleum flat grey primer, which I get from Bunnings, which is our local hardware store, and I grab a snag as well while I'm there, which is an Australian tradition. And it's actually really kind of hard to tell when you've primed it because the colours between the plastic and the primer are so similar, but I'm just trying to get a good coverage across everything. And then I'm starting with Administratum Grey. I always find that one a difficult one to say. And I'm just doing a dry brush over all the pillars to kind of giving them an edge highlight. Now you could go through with a brush and trying to edge highlight each individual one, but that will take a very long time because it's probably around 100 different pillars across all the different 7 terrain pieces. So I found with a dry brush is just a lot quicker at getting that sort of effect. And then for the actual bones, so there's a couple of different skulls. I'm using Rakarth Flesh. I'm using my Wise makeup brush, but this time I'm not doing a dry brushing technique, I'm doing an over brushing technique, which is basically you just load up some paint in there and then you just go for it. It's a very quick way of painting large areas. It's very hard to control, but it's very efficient in getting stuff done. And then while I still had paint loaded up on the brush, I was trying to paint some of these skulls that are around the edges. If you look closely on these pieces, down the very bottom of these pillars are kind of skulls and bones and a few rocks and stuff. So I was just trying to not waste the paint and paint them. But some are very difficult places to reach with a makeup brush, as it's not really designed for delicate painting. So I'm just going here along with a normal paintbrush and just painting it. And then while I'm doing the overbrushing, I've got some Warpstone Glow here, and I'm just painting in all the crystals here as green. You may notice the background's a little bit different. I'm actually on a little break holiday for myself. So I thought I'd do some of this painting while I was away. And then I'm also using the green for this kind of toxic wasteland goo kind of river thing, because I try and use color in at least 2 different places to kind of bring the models together. So once the Warpstone Glow dark green overbrushing was completed, I'm using Moot Green here, which is a light green layer paint, and I'm just trying to paint the cracks or the vertices, I guess. It's been a long time since I've gone to science class, but yeah, just basically all the edges. I'm just trying to paint a very thin Moot Green line. And then here I'm using Corax White. Sorry, I forgot to put the paint in the front. And I'm just doing some overbrushing here to paint these sort of smoke, I don't know, billowing smoke out of these geysers. And I'm also got these tentacles, so I'm just painting those white. And then with the white paint, I'm going even thinner through the Moot Green edges with a white layer. And I'll come back later with a technical paint to make sense. And then same with the, Toxic Lake. I'm just kind of picking out some light edges to be white. And then the eyebrows and cheeks of this skull that we painted Rakarth Flesh before, I'm also painting white. So now it's dried, it's time to use Agrax Earthshade. I find that Rakarth Flesh and Agrax Earthshade make a good bone kind of texture or color, or both. It doesn't work as well, unfortunately, on big items like this. I think it works really well for like a small skull, but I couldn't think of a better recipe, and I didn't really bring a lot of paints with me on my holiday. So if you've got a good suggestion on how to paint bone at this scale, please let me know. And then there's also those skulls I talked about before around the edges that I had painted with the brush or a little bit of with the overbrushing, and I'm just applying some Agrax Earthshade on those too. So moving back to the tentacle kind of weird monster thing, we used the Corax White before to paint the biological material as a kind of an undercoat rather than a grey. And then now I'm using my contrast paint here to go over it and give it this kind of reddy look. And this is the only place that I use the red on any of the models, but I think it works quite well because you want it to look kind of, like a living creature, and all the other ones are all sort of just natural terrain, like geysers and, bones and debris and stuff. So this is the only kind of living creature. So I think it being bright and standing out is good. And then you might notice here that I've left the big tusks without Agrax Earthshade, and so I'm using Seraphim Sepia as a different kind of wash. However, this bottle is almost run out, so it's so watered down that it's actually very hard to get any onto the actual model. But luckily, I've bought another bottle from my local game store, so this one works a lot easier. And so I'm just painting up the weird long tusks with this just to kind of give it a different look than the bone in the skull. You obviously don't need to do this, or you can use different colors, but I just found that it was too, mono colored if the whole piece was the same recipe. So by using the same base color but different shades kind of helps with that. Now that we've painted all of the tentacle stems, I'm using Abaddon Black, but any dark black color would work. And I've noticed there's a little kind of claw at the end of it. And again, I don't like using colors only in one spot, but here I thought it would make sense and be a good contrast to have these kind of claws as black. I think I use a similar recipe with my Tyranids that I've painted a couple of, but I think it kind of contrasts really well with the brightness and then the darkness. If I could be bothered, I'd probably come and edge highlight this with Dark Reaper, but I don't bother because it's just such a small, there's only 4 of them. So they do kind of click and play into the mouth of this monster, but I kind of broke one off by accident and it was just too fiddly. So what I've done is I've got some green stuff and I just put it down into the bottom, and I've just stick all 4 pieces in it, and this lets you kind of rearrange them to a unique shape. And I also noticed this crack here in the big skull, so I'm just putting some of the same green stuff along kind of the crack, then using the end of a paintbrush to try and push some of the green stuff in. Ideally, I should have done this before I primed, and definitely before I base coated it, so I'll have to go back and base coat it again, but it's better late than never. And so if you remember back at the start, we did Corax White over some of these edge highlights in these green sections. So now I've got Tesseract Glow, which is a technical paint from Citadel. You really need to give it a good shake because it does not mix well if you just leave it in the bottle for a long time. But what it does is it kind of paints that white, Corax White, into this really bright green and kind of puts a light shade over the rest of it. And then you'll notice that there's some cat fur, but also some just like rocks that were on the edges that aren't part of the pillars. And it was just too much grey on grey on grey. So I thought I'll paint these. If you're enjoying this content so far, consider leaving a like, a comment, or a subscribe. It really helps the channel out as YouTube uses this in its algorithm. I also try and respond to any comments that people might have individually. So yeah, if you've got any questions or any tips for me, please let me know. Anyway, just painting these rocks is a little bit time consuming and you want to kind of go slow, but it's quite easy. Moving on to the Plumes of smoke. I don't even know if Plumes is the correct word, but I'm using Averland Sunset, which is a base yellow paint from Citadel, and I'm just trying to paint the bottom third of the flames yellow. So I did try this once with my warband with the rats, whatever they're called, Skaven, and that was my first experience with painting flame, so I was a little bit nervous going into this if I'm going to be able to pull it off, but once you've done the bottom third yellow, it's time for the next third orange. You can see my cat Artemis in the background has decided to join me. And the idea behind this recipe is you do 1/3 yellow, 1/3 orange, 1/3 red, and then you try and blend in those transitions, and then you put a glaze of yellow over all three, and then you do a dry brush of black. So it sounds like a lot of steps, but you'll see here it's actually really straightforward. I am kind of watering the paint down a bit too much, so that means I'll have to come back with a second coat, but that's, you know, all the experts say, 2 thin coats, which I'm a bit impatient to do a lot of the time, so I usually try and just do 1 coat and make sure it's all spread out. But this is Evil Sunz Scarlet, which is a red paint. I don't actually really like this red paint. I prefer Mephiston red, but I ran out, so this is the only red. And then I'm just painting the final third red. This one is a little bit slower because their like tendrils are a lot more delicate. It's not like the base of the fire, which is all kind of the one color. So just take your time, but if you do make any mistakes like I just did then, it's easy enough to go back with Corax White and just fix up those white areas again. But this part's kind of relaxing, and yeah, without gluing these in, it's pretty easy to rotate around. And now I'm just blending 50-50 of the yellow and orange, and I'm kind of going along that join area and just trying to blur it a little bit to help the transition seem less jarring, especially because the Averland Sunset is quite a, I don't know, muted yellow. It's not very vibrant compared to the other two. So by mixing the two and then kind of going along the join, kind of just makes it a little bit easier. And then here I'm doing the same with the red and orange to being more of a reddy orange and going along the join and helping blur those lines. This is kind of like a subtle effect. You probably don't need to do this. And now I'm using a very bright yellow, Phalanx Yellow, and I've watered it down quite a lot, and then I just kind of go over the all 3 layers of the fire and just kind of give it this shade. Again, this step's probably not mandatory, and you really kind of want it watered down a lot, otherwise it will just overwrite the layers that you've spent all that time building up. So maybe I should have watered mine down to a bit more of a lighter shade consistency. But it kind of has an interesting effect because it'll have these pockets of bright yellow. And then this is the final dry brush of Abaddon Black. I kind of regret this step because I didn't get enough black off the makeup brush. So when I do the dry brush, I kind of darken it a lot more than I had anticipated. In theory, you only want like the very edges with a very thin black layer to kind of look like fire. So because I've got too much black on the brush, it's kind of making it look very sooty and dirty and stuff, and I'm kind of a bit upset at myself for doing that. So yeah, just make sure if you are doing this step to make sure you've taken as much off the brush as you can. Otherwise, yeah, you might run the risk of really darkening it a lot more from that vibrant look. So you can see now it's a lot darker. And now I'm using the grey paint, and I think it's Administratum Grey again, and I've just watered it down quite a lot, and I'm just doing a very light wash over the smoke so that the little grooves and bumps of the model, the paint can pool into there, creating like a shadow effect. You could obviously use like Nuln oil or black, but I was going for really subtle effects, so I've just picked a grey colour here. And I'm just trying to avoid putting it into the flames. But yeah, I could probably go a darker grey again and just try and add more depth, but I just couldn't be bothered at this point. And now I'm using Balor Brown. So this, out of the 7, this one kind of has a lot of, I want to call dirt on the ground. Like it's not big rocks and it's not the pillars, it's just kind of textured ground. So I'm using this brown color to paint in the dirt where these fire geysers are popping out of the ground, and I'm trying not to get it into anywhere that I want to remain grey, but it's quite hard, and I'm using a very thick brush for this, which is probably not the right one for the job. I was a little nervous about this decision because it will look quite different from the others. But now I'm getting Rhinox Hide, which is the brown color, and I'm painting in the rocks that we did in the earlier step. I should have done this at the same time, but I hadn't decided what I was going to do yet. So just anything that isn't a bone, that isn't a skull, that isn't one of the pillars, is just getting a light brown coating. And then I've watered down the Rhinox Hide into a shade, and I'm going over all of that Balor Brown from before. And again, this shade's going into the grooves, and what it does is it just kind of creates a bit more of texture because the model itself is textured. So by colouring in the grooves really highlights that. And now I've got my plastic glue from Citadel, and I'm just going to apply them. They do have a click and like lock thing, but these are really heavy, like they're solid plastic, and it kind of topples over and falls out a lot. So I'm just putting some Citadel plastic glue just to help with the seal. And you'll notice there's also one geyser that is kind of empty, so I've just painted that yellow, orange, and red because it hasn't yet erupted. And these are the final products. So there's 7 unique ones. I think they all look really interesting and different. I'm really happy with Games Workshop's detail on these terrains. And for $20 dues, it was a lot of fun to paint and a lot of different textures that I haven't used before. If you've made it this far to the end, please consider leaving a like, a comment, or a subscribe. It really helps me out. And I've hoped you've enjoyed it. If you got any tips, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Bye.